As most of you know, CEDAC manages the CBH program on behalf of the Department of Housing and Community Development and in partnership with the Mass Rehab Commission. The community-based housing program was established in 2004 following extensive advocacy to create rental units with enhanced accessibility features with a goal to promote independent living opportunities for people at risk of institutionalization or homelessness as a result of their disability. After more than 15 years of running the program and commitments to nearly 500 units of housing, we've learned a great deal, including from the many architects and developers who've made use of the program, and we're delighted to present our updated design guidelines today. I'd like to introduce Bronya Clifton, the Manager of Supportive Housing and Special Projects at DHCD since 2018. Prior to that time, Bronya spent more than 2 decades as a CEDAC project manager, specializing in supportive housing, and during that time underwrote many CBH units.
Thank you, Sarah. Is my mic okay? Great. CBH is one of the Commonwealth's most effective tools to create housing that is purpose-built to meet the needs of individuals and families with disabilities. Like many other states, Massachusetts developed an Olmsted Plan, a comprehensive plan for placing people with disabilities in the least restrictive setting. The Olmsted Plan was developed in response to a 1999 Supreme Court opinion which prohibited the unjustified institutional isolation of people with disabilities. With your attention and commitment to these design guidelines, we can enhance the livability and functionality of CBH units and increase the visitability and the universal design features of all of our affordable housing stock. The key will be to study these guidelines and incorporate the dimensional and functional requirements at the beginning of the design and site planning process. Now back to Sarah.
Thank you, Bronya. Now I'd like to introduce Paul Warkentin of Davis Square Architects. DSA has over 3 decades of experience designing and helping to renovate hundreds of affordable housing projects in Massachusetts and beyond. They have worked with DHCD for over 20 years as part of a select group of architects retained to review and evaluate their one-stop funding applications, as well as consulting for sustainability and green issues. Over the past 12 years, Paul has consulted with CEDAC and DHCD to develop and help administer the CBH accessibility guidelines, as well as DHCD's universal design standards.
Thank you, Sarah and Bronya. Pleasure to be here today. Let me just share my screen here and we'll get started. So, and we'll go to the next slide. And off we go. So CBH has been around for a while, but as Sarah and Bronya just noted, it funds affordable, integrated housing for people with disabilities and persons at risk of institutional or homelessness. It's intended to serve a population who have greater needs for accessibility, who have greater needs for architectural accessibility than the baseline regulations of ADA, UFS, or MAB require. We've always known that people are able to live better lives independently than in institutions. In the past year with COVID-19, we've seen that really more than ever. People living in settings like nursing homes, congregate settings, and other conditions have experienced much more serious, they make up less than 1% of the overall US population, but they've made up nearly 50% of COVID deaths in the United States. And in Massachusetts, it's been even higher. So it's been quite a dire situation. As I said, it's intended with the point of the CBH has been to serve have greater needs than what normal architectural requirements provide. And those accessibility enhancements are needed to promote independence, particularly among people for whom those basic standards don't meet their needs. So one point that I'm going to make now, and I'm going to keep making overall, is that CBH does not exist on its own. It's in addition to code requirements like MAAB. When looking at what we have on this in the CBH requirements, we deliberately don't include what's already in the code. That doesn't mean you don't have to comply with that. And the same goes for other requirements that DHCD has, such as the universal design checklist, visibility, etc. So, but since CBH's inception in 2004, DHCD has awarded nearly $74 million to fund 473 units in 148 projects. That's given us a lot of information about what works and what doesn't, and a lot of questions have come up over the years about that have, and we felt like an update was in order. DHCD and CEDAC felt like we needed to take a look at our standards and help to clarify the checklist requirements, and also to allow us to make improvements to meet the needs of disabled residents. So please refer to those standards. They've been emailed around from CEDAC. The link to those, it's on their website. I've got the link here. Please, not right now, but please refer to that list in the URL as and include as part, that's also going to be included as part of the Winter QAP's Appendix I for design and self-evaluation and accessibility. So many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with CBH. You've done CBH projects or been a part of it. So I'll briefly describe some of the original requirements. The first version of CBH had a few major items that were greater than MAB, most notably required automatic door openers at entrances, pre-wiring for those kinds of openers at entry doors to CBH units, and a larger turning diameter in kitchens and baths, and most significantly, perhaps, a requirement for roll-in showers instead of allowing tubs as the code does. And there were a number of others, but those are probably the most significant in things that were introduced. Much of the intent behind the program, the ideas behind it, are described in the narrative at the beginning of that of the checklist that we added to this narrative in order to give a little bit more background to people to understand what the goals of the program were and help to explain the intent of the checklist, rather than just have a bare checklist that told you, do this and do that. We really wanted people to understand the program goals of integration and promoting independence and the context into which this CBH checklist fits. And so I'll be getting into some of those particulars as we go along. So first and foremost, CBH is intended as an enhancement to requirements in access regulations, including MAB in 521 CMR, the federal section 504 uses the federal standard called the Uniform Federal Accessibility Standard, or UFAS, the Fair Housing Act, and the ADA. It builds on those and is in addition to all of those. Please be sure you're always following all the funding source requirements, such as 504, and most of all the building code. It always is going to apply. And when looking at what we have on the checklist, we deliberately don't include what's already included in the code. The reason for this is just that we don't want to be redundant. We don't want to be repeating things that are already known to be in the code in order to not introduce potential for misunderstandings or we worded it in 5 words when the code requires 10. So it's really important and foundational to be complying with the things in the code, and then on top of that, be doing these things for CBH. But it also builds on those code requirements. For instance, if this code required 1 fully accessible group 2 unit, but you were planning to have 2 CBH units, does that mean you need to only do 1 group 2 plus and then only do the CBH units, CBH items for the unit that is a CBH, that other unit that is a CBH unit? The answer is no. Both of those units will need to comply with all of the Group 2 requirements as well as the CBH requirements. That's part of what we have spelled out in the narrative. Another example might be is that MAB requires that ramps be made with a minimum slope as possible, not simply just the maximum slope of 1 in 12. So with CBH, we expect that designers do their best to stretch out those ramps as much as possible. And maybe you can get those ramps to be less than 1 in 20 and not require handrails and make it easier for everybody. So also thinking about this in the terms of the context of the qualified application plan, there are other additional accessibility related requirements within the QAP, particularly for universal design, visibility, and senior housing. And some have asked us, why doesn't CBH have anything in its requirements for visibility and universal design? And the reason is that there are other lists out there that apply to all projects. And we're trying to keep the CBH list focused on projects seeking CBH funding because, again, we don't want to be redundant, and that leads to more confusion in terms of having one list require something using one set of wording and another list having another set of wording. So again, it doesn't exist on its own, CBH. It's in addition to those universal design checklist and visibility requirements that are in the accessibility appendix of the QAP. Now, CBH will prioritize projects that incorporate these universal design features and promote visibility. And because that furthers the Commonwealth's goal of integration. Every effort by developers should be used to incorporate those universal design or visibility features into CBH units, even if they're not feasible in all the units in the project. If you have a project where you just can't change all of the interior doors of a units to make them visible, obviously that's going to be something that we are looking for in an accessible unit. But there are other items in that list too, like rocker switches or what have you. It's really key to look at those requirements because, again, we didn't want to have something be stated twice, leading to a little bit of confusion. Now, we recently have rolled out DHCDs has introduced some senior housing requirements that are very similar to CBH units. In that case, those will apply to all the units in the project, whereas the CBH ones will be directed to the CBH units only. There's a lot of overlap with those, but just keep in mind that in particularly those CBH units would be set aside for persons considered eligible based on the risk of institutionalization or homelessness as a result of their disability, as Sarah mentioned. So we've recently visited some completed CBH units and talked to some residents, some caregivers, building managers, and developers, as well as others who are charged with administering the CBH program. And that feedback told us to make the standards more clear and remove ambiguity. We started doing CBH, we developed a set of guidelines based on a wonderful report that Kessler and McGinnis, a great group of people who do a lot of accessibility consulting, did in 2006 that reviewed accessibility in general. And they had a set of recommendations for enhanced accessibility. It was a great list, gave us a lot of ideas, a lot of great things. But as a checklist, it left something lacking because it just the wording of it said things like ample space for maneuverability. And when you start talking to architects and contractors, they want to know how many inches equals ample. And so the point of our CBH stuff was to say, try to be as specific as possible so that people know we're not leaving them hanging and we're having to engage in guesswork as to what we're asking of them. So in looking at what kinds of problems people are having in terms of actually living in units, one thing it's really important to remember is when I talked about those typical handicap regulations, they tend to focus on dimensional bottlenecks, the sizes of doors, the clearances around doors, or the size of a bathroom, the clearances around a tub or a shower or a toilet, or the turning circle in a kitchen, or whether you have being able to access a specific thing. So it's all about these various, making sure you have enough room here, or making sure you have enough room here, or making sure you have enough room here. And there's one problem with this, is that their regulations just don't have any requirements for overall living spaces. There's something that says you still have to have, a larger unit, for instance, within which all of these other things fit. Yes, there are code required minimums for bedroom sizes and so on, or for number of occupants, but those are really pretty minimal in terms of what a person with a disability might need, especially if you consider that if we had like a set size of a unit and we just grow the bathroom and we grow the kitchen and we grow a little bit of space around a door at a corridor, all of the bedrooms shrink and the living room shrinks. If we don't make the pie bigger, when those pieces eat up the rest of those other sections. So those living spaces just tend to be made smaller, and it can be problematic because our CBH population actually needs more living space. In addition to all of the paraphernalia, furniture that us fortunate to be not living with disabilities have, they have all of their additional items that they have to keep. They have additional needs for mobility, and they have more things that they put into it. And I'll get into that a little bit in the future in a later slide. But this is something that we noticed, and therefore, what we felt like would be appropriate was that we needed to decidedly make handicapped units larger, particularly in CBH. So, for instance, a one-bedroom DHCD recommended area is 600 square feet. We feel like an additional square footage of 20% will help to allow space for all of the things that are going to be needed for people to be able to store additional items, room for wheelchairs, walkers, etc. Or a two-bedroom, 800 plus 20 would get you to 960 square feet. There is a fair amount of storage, and we considered being specific about telling people to provide definite storage space, but because needs are, what we found is that since needs by individuals are so individualized and variable, we felt that it made more sense to simply allow for adaptability and allow to tell developers to make the floor area of the unit larger and allow for later installation of whether it be shelving or storage furniture, etc., making space for future accommodations, whatever they may be. So just by way of example, this is a photograph that we took from a unit we visited, the Dona Betzarita Gutierrez Co-op Apartments at the Blessed Sacrament site in JP. Great development, wonderful people there. We were really thankful that they and others were allowed us to take people to have the phalanx of folks walking through their apartments. This happens to be a photo of a second unit in a bedroom, in a two-bedroom unit. The resident of this unit lives in the unit alone. So what you're seeing in this picture is mainly all of the additional medical and other paraphernalia that this person needs to function. You've got you've got extra mobility devices like wheelchairs, you've got the Hoyer lift, you've got a variety of medical supplies or hygienic supplies. So what we were seeing is just these folks just have more stuff that we need to be able to accommodate. And another really important thing to keep in mind is that there's another function, another aspect of needing more space, and that's space for caregivers. There's often family, there's aides, maybe there are PCAs who are in the unit providing care or helping out. Even though they don't live in the unit, they still take up space, and you need somewhere for that person to be when they're there helping out. Well, the goal of our program is to promote independence. This independence, it's really key, is to say that this independence doesn't mean an absence of help. You can get help and still be independent. It's perfectly okay. We're not trying to, when we say independence, it doesn't mean that people are living on islands. We also included a few illustrations of what not to do. And this illustration comes from something I realized after spending a day in our office in a wheelchair. And that's what works while walking doesn't always work when you're in a wheelchair. When one's walking around, you're walking in a given direction and you need to make a turn. Now, pivoting while walking is so natural that you never even think about it. It doesn't even enter your mind. It's without a second thought, because you're not thinking about the forward momentum that you have. In a wheelchair, when you're going in a straight line and you have to make a turn, it completely kills your momentum. You have to do this sweet little pivot in order to keep that going. If you have to then do it again in the opposite direction, it's even harder, because you turn that forward momentum into a rotational thing, and now you got to do it again the other way. It's really problematic, particularly when you have to get started again, when you have to push a door open. So having these kinds of S-terms, thinking about how to configure how somebody is going to move around from one door to another. This isn't something that's in the code, and it's hard to be really super specific about it in terms of how close these doors are together, because every plan is different. But it's just a message to really be mindful as when one's laying out, designing a unit, of the kinds of things that we might not think about when we're looking at something in plan or when we're walking around, but really make a big difference to somebody who's in a chair. We also added some recommendations with examples. So we drew a sample unit. Obviously not all units have to look like this, but we included an example of a plan that shows about the right level of detail for schematic design that one would typically see in a one-stop. So we showed the sample plan enough so that you could see some furniture, turning diameters. We're indicating the closets. We showed that where there's the package shelf, there's more on that later. The point to this is that designers really and architects really need to be giving us enough information that it's easy for us as reviewers to see what the intent is and to see that you're meeting the regulations and the guidelines. It really, make our lives easy when it comes to looking at these things. Include enough information so that we can see, yes, we've got a turning circle there, or yes, we've got furniture. We can see how the unit is intended to be laid out and used. As for this particular design, it has a few features that you might want to think about and notice that it has very few turns. You can go straight from the living room down through that hall, get to the bedroom. You could put pocket doors onto the bathroom or the bedroom just as an enhancement to avoid the problems of door sling. That's something that you could do if you wanted. Pocket doors are perfectly okay by the code, and CBH doesn't require them. Just be sure that the clear width of a pocket door still complies. And also really important, really basic, but label the CBH units. Show on the plan, this is the CBH unit. This is this is intended to be a group 2 CBH unit. That way we know where to find them, know where to look for them, and we can start evaluating it based on what you're telling us. So parking. Parking always introduces issues because, you know, we live in a very sadly car-centric culture. And so we inevitably have a lot of discussions about, on many projects that are centered about parking. You know, our standards call for projects having one accessible space per CBH unit. And they also require a minimum one van accessible space. Now, this is both of these are in excess of the code because the code you know, may require, if you had a project which didn't have any parking at all, you wouldn't be required to provide handicap parking, you know, because it's just not there. In the case of CBH, we really need you to have that one van accessible spot in order to be able to allow people to get to medical appointments, for instance. It's really critical. But on the subject of having one accessible space per CBH units, this can be reduced at transit-oriented development projects that have minimal parking. They have, you know, fewer than the zoning allowed parking. If you've received zoning relief for parking requirements, you know, we can be talking about reducing the number of accessible spaces for the CBH units. Indicate this if this is the route you're taking. Please do indicate this on your checklist. A couple other changes to the checklist we had. The picture at the top on this is from the Trustman Apartments in Brookline. We have a new building to the left and a nice big open space. One thing we're thinking about when we looked at places like this, keep in mind that folks with mobility impairments may want to spread out over longer periods outside, given that it takes longer to get in and out of the building. And they may be more sensitive to direct sun. So we introduce a requirement to provide shade. We don't want to be super particular about how the shade is provided, whether it be with furnishings like an umbrellas or a trellis or some other shaded device. But it's just something to think about if we've got, you know, nice open space to make that space more accessible and usable by everybody. As far as the automatic door openers, we added some language to be clear about making sure that not only if we have places where we're making allowances for future automatic door openers at unit entries, that there's not only power provided, but don't have a soffit, a roof, a ceiling structure, some other obstruction, a sprinkler head, a fire alarm device, something that's over the door that would then become a problem, then you have to relocate when it comes time to put in that automatic door opener. So this is to be without modification of ceilings or walls. Also providing electric power to allow, we also, in the interest of furthering the goals of equity and independence, we want to expand accessibility to common areas. So further, we're now also we want to provide electric power to allow for future installation of automatic door openers at common interior spaces, such as community rooms and laundry rooms, without modification or ceilings or walls. So similar, you know, have that power provided at, you know, if you have 2 doors to a community room, you can provide it at just one of those doors. Simple thing to be able to do when you're in a new construction phase or an extensive rehab. Then there's our package shelf. So there's been a fair amount of discussion about package shelves. Important consideration about these shelves is that these not be a protruding object in the corridor. You know, so typically a lot of times we have a corridor in a project, we want to recess this into an alcove or some other, code compliant means to be able to say, yes, this is not a protruding object. And, you know, there's lots of great illustrations in the code about how to make that happen. And we also just wanted to be definitive about the size of that shelf. Figure about the size of a piece of paper, 8 inches by 12 inches. But in the interest of flexibility, we also said that while we want to provide the shelf outdoors, the inside shelf, we're not necessarily requiring this to be installed. There should be space for it if somebody needed to be able to provide that function of the shelf with, say, a piece of furniture. Maybe inside the unit, it's more useful for the resident to be able to have that extra space be a place for their locker or some other storage. So we decided to add a little bit of flexibility on that score. Going back to our little sample plan, one thing we also wanted to be more distinct about here was the space requirements around in bedrooms. Before we simply said, well, you need to be able to provide access to both sides of the bed. And then people would always ask, well, what does that mean? How much is that? How big is it? How big is the bed even? So we said, look, we're going to clear this up once and for all. If it's in a master bedroom, it would be a queen size bed, a twin size bed in whatever secondary bedroom you may have. And the clearances are going to be 66 inches on one side of the bed and 42 inches around on the other sides. So that's what we're going to be. It's the goal that we had of reducing ambiguity as to what this was going to go. Again, show that furniture so that we can see how this is working, and this will also assist you in locating other features in the future, like electrical outlets, which you may not have in a one-stop, but you're going to need to do that soon enough as you're developing your design. But one thing that's really important, I said this before, but I'm going to keep saying it. Please don't try to squeeze CBH units into the same floor plan footprint as you have standard non-accessible units, unless those standard non-accessible units are all really big. But if that's the case, you've got other questions perhaps. The CBH units really need to be designed from the get-go as having more space. So it's important to ask about seeking CBH at an early phase. If you're an architect, you're talking to your developers, consider, have that conversation. Are you going to be thinking about doing CBH? There are greater requirements. We'll want to bake them in early on. It can be it can become really difficult to incorporate these kinds of features once schematic design is already complete. You end up having to move walls, ductwork, structure, pipe chases, all kinds of problems. And again, just showing all that information on those plans to make it easy for us to review. Some other changes that we had for the checklist, we had a fairly extensive debate about bifold doors. The previous checklist required bifold doors, and the thought being that, well, they just work well. The bottom line is people generally don't like them. They tend to break. When they're open, the door itself becomes an obstruction because it can't swing out a full 180 degrees. Instead, have regular swinging doors because it either swings 90 degrees and just hits a wall, or you can swing it a full 180 degrees and you have much better access to the full width of the closet. No carpet. This was kind of a no-brainer. Another thing, having a low pile carpet is allowed by the code, but it's really just pretty inappropriate for a CBH unit. You want to have a hard surface. Another thing that we were noticing a fair amount of, and there was a fair amount of discussion about, was the need for electrical power outlets. I don't know about you, but every day it goes by, I seem to have more devices that need to be recharged. So, we're in older housing. I live in my 80-year-old house. It does not have enough outlets. And so having enough outlets is something that is really important. And it's doubly important for people who have even along with all of their computers and iPhones and whatever, they also have their items for for their mobility. You have to recharge wheelchairs. You may be recharging prosthetics. You may have an oxygen device. You know, any number of needs that you have to also provide for. So older buildings may not meet current code, and they may not be required to provide all the upgrade, you know, in just a level 2 renovation. They might not be required to replace all of those outlets. But for rehab projects, we really just want to say you need to, inside the unit, meet the current electrical code for new construction to make sure you've got all the outlets you need. And finally, air conditioning. Air conditioning, you know, this is something we're obviously requiring in senior housing, but, you know, folks with CBH, folks who are in CBH units, air conditioning needs to be provided by the sponsors. And we don't want to say a quote unquote central system, because there's a lot of different AC systems out there and they function a lot of different ways. Don't want to be particularly prescriptive about that, but we don't want it just to have this be window mounted AC units. They need the controls need to be in the zone of reach and allowing people to be able to manipulate that themselves. Even if there aren't provisions for air conditioning throughout the project, it should definitely be provided at the CBH units. And I'm told, you may have heard a few dings here, that there are some questions. So I'm going to pause for a second here and pick up some of those. Sarah, can you?
Absolutely. First question comes from one of our other reviewing architects, Neil Mongold from Narrow Gate, noting that some previous requirements refer to elements that might not be specifically related to CBH units. So a specific example being automatic door openers at building entrances. And this is often interpreted to mean entrances that wouldn't be used by CBH residents if, for example, you have a project with multiple buildings. And the question is whether this is our intent in the requirements. I know my own perspective is that really speaks to visitability, and which is a very high priority for CBH as well as, you know, for all projects by DHCD. But could you speak to that, Paul?
I mean, that's a great question. I mean, I think, you know, and I understand the concern here. You may have a campus project or a scattered site project where, you know, you may have a building, you know, a campus of 10 buildings, and, you know, half of them have no CBH, have no accessible units in them, and they may not have any common space in them either. And providing powered door entries into all of those can become difficult. What I would say is that I would recommend noting what you want to do. We encourage as much access as possible and incorporating the door openers at as many locations as possible. If it's not feasible to, for whatever reason, make a note of that in comments and tell us what the intent is going to be, and we can address specific questions. Definitely, you know, if you have a building that has community common rooms, laundries, things like that, you definitely want to be prioritizing providing access to those kinds of locations.
Thank you, Paul. A couple more questions. One of our attendees wants to know whether we recommend installation of the low voltage door release wiring in a situation where you're wiring for a future power door operator.
There's a lot of particular items about door hardware that, you know, we didn't want the requirements to get too far into the weeds for. I mean, typically what we would say is that for the future modifications, you're going to be replacing a fair amount of the hardware for the door, and the wiring, if you can, maybe that wiring can be done, you know, in the replaced door frame or something like that. I mean, the intent to our talking about no wall modifications is really about just not having to make the gross changes over the head of the door that would, might require something like, a structural change or of moving a sprinkler. But the low voltage wiring, I wouldn't necessarily pre-wire all the low voltage to the strike of the door that isn't there yet.
Thank you, Paul. Next question is about the package shelf and whether we've confirmed that it's not considered an intrusion into the pull or push side clear floor area required for door swings, and or wouldn't that be an issue since every unit has a power door opener?
Well, that's a great point, is that if the CBH unit has a power door opener, then the push and pull, the clear floor areas that are required by code are, they're met by the fact that you have a power door opener. But I'm always going to say more space is better. If you can keep that shelf out of that any possible clearances around the door, that's always a good idea.
Thank you. Two more questions, and others may have questions along the way. We'll go with two more for now, and we'll try to save a few minutes at the end if there are additional questions. Next is about AC, which we just spoke about, which is whether through wall units are acceptable, and what about PTAC units? That's a new term for me.
A PTAC unit, and I forgive me if I don't remember what exactly. Let's see, PTAC. Don't want to get off track trying to remember that acronym. But
so we'll be able to follow up with some FAQs.
Yeah, I think the key thing, a through wall, something that's permanent, a sleeve that provides a permanent way to provide AC would be accessible. Please just make sure those controls for the AC are in an accessible location. Think about the layout of the unit, that unit's not going to be buried behind a piece of furniture or something like that. I think that's one of the real keys to those. In making sure that it's not a protruding object. A lot of times a sleeve might be if it's going into an accessible route. PTAC units, as long as you can control it, I wouldn't see a problem, as long as it's not protruding into some other location, and B, has controls that meet the standards. Okay. Well,
sorry, just one more question, Paul. And then
okay, that's fine.
We will close questions for now. For flooring requirements, that is hard surfaces and no carpet, does this apply to common areas or just within the unit?
We wanted to be common areas. Typically, we're not seeing a lot of. I mean, it's the requirement that we put in here was for, we were being specific about units when we laid it out. So at this time, we're not prescribing the use of carpet completely in common areas. Obviously, if it's in a common area, and you're thinking about wheels that are coming in from outdoors, they're gonna, you can't wipe your, if you've got dirty or wet or muddy wheelchair wheels, there's no mat you can wipe those off on. You are going to roll more stuff in. So I'd think very carefully about whether I wanted to have that carpet's got to be super cleanable, and you got to have a good program for keeping it clean.
Okay, thank you, Paul.
Okay. Okay, let's keep rolling here. So moving on into bathrooms. Like I said before, CBH has always required units to have a roll-in shower, and regular access codes allow tubs in accessible units. CBH does not. That's one of the special things about it, is that we don't let you do a tub in an accessible unit. But we wanted to add more specifics about drainage. It helps to understand the reality is there are a lot of times somebody may be helping the resident bathe, that curtain is going to be open a lot of the time. Water is going to come out. Even when you don't have an aid, water is going to come out. And even with the curtain closed. So making sure that there's an alternate drain outside and you're sloping the floor around that to that alternate drain. There's a bunch of different ways of doing this. You could slope the entire drain towards the shower. You could be putting in a trench drain, or you could be doing 2 drains where both of them have some slope inside and out, as is shown in this photograph. Really, this is making sure that you want to be able to do that. Making sure that you've got that shower base, that there's enough room and structure for it to be dropped down and be able to fit into without having a curb at the bottom. It's super important. Be looking at those plumbing cut sheets. There's a lot of shower and base surround products which don't comply with code. So keep in mind that you can only have that half-inch threshold there. Also in the bathroom, MAB's Group 2A standards would allow you to have a removable cabinet at a vanity. So that would be perfectly code compliant, but that's not something we want to do in CBH. We don't want to have that vanity cabinet below the sink. It does lead to a storage question. As you can see, people need to be able to store things in their bathrooms. There's a lot of other ways to consider this, and we didn't want to proscribe certain things or prescribe certain things. You could be putting in a small closet that's accessible from the bathroom. Another option might be a wall cabinet for cleaning size that's positioned above the toilet. We do talk about it promoting independence, but it's worth considering since a disabled resident may not be the person doing the cleaning. And so just think about those other possible options if you don't want to, if you want to provide that extra storage. Also, we included another additional item about medicine cabinets. The medicine cabinet needs to, since you typically can't put it on the mirror when you've got that mirror medicine cabinet is typically not in the reach range. So we want to be specific about that medicine cabinet being located in an accessible reach range. And you may not be able to see it here, but I will. It's because it blends really well because it's white, but I'm trying to circle it here with my arrowhead. And but that would be something that is an accessible reach range and compliant with the standards. You just don't want to be reaching across the sink to get at it. And in kitchens, we also wanted to be specific about the height of wall cabinets, that we wanted to have the bottom shelf of those wall cabinets at 48 inches above the floor, except where there's maybe some greater clearance required at sinks or at ranges is required by like the manufacturer of a typically range manufacturer or cooktop manufacturers will tell you that height has to be a little bit higher. But with a 34-inch countertop, a 48-inch high item does allow for both being able to reach the cabinet and being able to have appliances such as a blender or a microwave or a toaster oven. And here's just another picture showing you that same thing, that higher cabinets at the cooktop. Those are obviously not required to be at 48 inches. Are there any further questions specific to the standards, Sarah, that you have before we move on to the review process?
Yes, here's another question that's just come in.
Okay.
Which is whether grab bars need to be a particular color that is a contrast to the walls. Of course, we most commonly see the silver metal, but the person asking this question is considering a less industrial looking color for an upcoming project.
There is no requirement on color of grab bars. My mom lives in a not assisted living, but A continuing care place, they've got these nice dark bronze grab bars, all the hardware they match all the hardware in the place. It looks great. You know, I would say go for it if you if you want. Okay, so wanting to talk about the review process. So there's a couple of key steps to this that, you know, reviewers are looking for as we move through things. So the first step in, you know, of reviewing these, we review all one-stop applications for CBH. So how you're doing on CBH. There's three key things we're looking for when we're looking through at that stage. One is your schematic level plans. We're not expecting these plans to be fully dimensioned, but they should be graphically developed enough to see that the clearances in the units are achievable and that the space is adequately sized. So have that square footage clearly stated on the units so we can tell how many square feet you've got in each unit. It's really helpful. And being able to see, you know, maybe you put down a few key dimensions, put in that 66-inch turning circle. Show, don't tell. You know, being able to see how you're going to do it. Don't just say, yes, I'm going to meet all the standards. Show us how the standards are going to be met. The reviewer should be able to see it. Another example might be that on a sloping site, providing enough topographical information on site plans to see how people are getting from one level of the site to another level of the site. You know, the elevation is at this height here and it's at that height there. How do you get between those? Where's that ramp? What's the slope of that ramp? Providing that information is super helpful. Another reminder, trying to keep those ramps as minimal as possible. 1 in 12 is a maximum, not a minimum. And if you get to that 1 in 20, you don't need handrails. Also, that the outline specification. Obviously, we're not asking you to write everything into an outline specification at a schematic level drawing, but there's a lot of things that should be supporting what your story is you're telling for CBH. Having the flooring saying whether you're, you know, what kind of hard surface flooring, hardware, making mention of your automatic door openers in the hardware section of the outline spec, describing your bath accessories, having that be consistent, appliances that those support the story about whether, you know, your wall ovens and cooktops and so on. And just also don't forget those MEP sections and having them say the proper things that we need for fire alarm devices or plumbing devices. Now the plans may not be fully developed enough to include all the details, but we should be able to see it in, but when you do get to the point of having fully dimensioned plans, details, and specs, you know, this shouldn't look completely different. Like I said, you know, this is the time that you want to, you know, get your basics down so that you're not having to move walls later because something wasn't sized right. And again, keep in mind that CBH checklist isn't by itself. You know, think about those universal design standards as well as, you know, the visibility requirements, and most importantly, the building code. You know, can't emphasize that enough. So what after the next round after a one-stop submission would be getting the contract documents. So at this phase, you're going to have fully dimensioned plan drawings, and those are going to be verifying that those clearances and units are going to be there. This is really not the time to be moving walls. If you're coming with a final set of reviewed drawings, contractor has bid them or is bidding, you don't want to be moving things at this point. It's going to cause a lot of heartburn. So, you know, having to introduce a major change at this point is not a good time. Having elevations in kitchens and baths and other details to show that all those required features are going to be included. Again, you know, showing that information is really important. You know, having those dimensions show the clearances is key. You know, please don't make the reviewers have to get out their calculators in order to figure out that there isn't enough space at a door clearance. Specifications should include all the required items that we've talked about, including plumbing and electrical, as I said before. But now, if it's not in the spec at this point, you don't own it. So it will end up being a change order to add if it's something we have to do later. And finally, the checklist. Again, this is something we're going to go back and look at the one-stop checklist to make sure that the items that we're committed to were at that time are included in the contract documents. So if it's an item in that checklist, it needs to be described and supported in the drawings and specs. And a good, clear set of drawings is really going to help the reviewer find that information and see where it's at. As reviewers at this point, we should be verifying that everything is included, not having to give people bad news and requiring developers to make substantial changes. But we will if we have to. If the spaces aren't there, we are prepared to be able to say, we're throwing the flag and something's going to have to change. And finally, verification during construction. So at this point, lender advisors are doing checks on making sure that that the standards are being followed. And at this point, you're just accurately executing the contract drawings, right? This is easy. Just do it on the plans and you're fine. And I'm sure everybody on this call has never had a problem in construction. Ridiculous, of course. Changes happen all the time. That's not how it works. You have value engineering. There's existing conditions. There's more coordination. There may be contractor mistakes. There's all kinds of things that can happen that can throw the plan off. And it's really crucial that the project team, the developer, the architect needs to proactively inform lender advisors of anything that's going on that could affect the CBH requirements, and make sure those things or make sure there's some kind of a plan to keep things on track. Lender advisors we should be reminding the project team to tell them, please, lender advisors, all of you listening here, please remind project team members to tell them about any changes that you're making that could affect providing any CBH access features, because the onus is on the developer to make it right. And the lender advisors should not have to be detectives. We shouldn't be having to go around and dig up bodies to try to figure out what happened. Come to us, tell us what's going on. At all phases, lender advisor reports should be reflecting the progress of the work in place relative to CBH checklist items, as well as any observed code MAB accessibility issues. So lender advisors, please make commentary about what the state of progress is on the accessibility issues in your reports. And also including any observed problems in those reports, because those reports are going to go to lenders as well as the project team, and it's on the project team to respond and address any problems or issues that come up. When thinking about how to go about looking at things, I think there's, as I look at projects, there's kind of 3 key checkpoints that I like to think about. The first being at the stage of having rough framing in. So you can see where all the walls are basically going to be. You can look for areas that seem tight. If it seems tight, get out a tape measure. See if you actually do have those clearances in the kitchen or the bathroom or the doors. At the next step would be having most of the rough plumbing or electrical devices in place. At this point, you can see where the plumbing fixtures are going to go, where the electrical devices are going to go, if those electrical devices are being provided, making sure that all the things that we're committed to are actually being installed. And then at final, and again, contractors being contractors, they might be doing the work the way they always do work, and not necessarily you got to make sure they're looking at the plans and following all the rules. And then finally, the last big point would be at near completion. Obviously, not necessarily when everything is cleaned and perfect and done, but at this point, you're looking for all of the things should be there. The fixtures have been installed, cabinets are there, electrical devices are there, grab bars, other accessories. These should all be visible. You should be able to see what's going on and make sure that we've got everything that was designed and planned. So finally, do you have, if there are any further questions, please madly type them in. I assume there may be more. Again, these guidelines are at CEDAC.org, the URL's up on there. If you have any other particular questions, please go ahead and email me at paulwarkentin@davisquare.com or Sarah Barkan at CEDAC.org. And thank you so much. And I believe Bronya had another item that she wanted to mention.
Yes, before we go to that, Paul, just have a couple more design-related questions, and then we will open the floor back up to Bronya to talk about a few DHCD policy matters. So one comes from Neil again. If there's a site that's designed with a grade change that's unnecessarily high for other purposes, and therefore you'd have a longer ramp than necessary, would we be looking for that to be redesigned so that we could minimize the ramp to the CBH unit or the building entrance, whatever the case may be?
I'm not sure about. So is the ramp existing, or is it? You mean? Not quite sure I follow, but I mean, it sounds like a bit of a judgment call, frankly, as to whether or not it's hard to answer without seeing the plan. Sorry, Neil, I'm sure you understand, I hope.
Well, let's see. If it's okay with you, Paul, I'm going to go ahead and allow Neil to ask the question verbally.
That'd be great.
Okay, great. Neil, hope that's okay with you. All right, Neil, I think you're unmuted. If I did that
Okay, great. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yep.
great. Thanks, Paul. I realize that's a hard question. There was a project that had units were set up. It's a new construction, so the units were set up higher in order to achieve sort of more privacy from the street level. It was like a close to the street, new townhouse kind of development.
Okay.
And but the unit, the units didn't have to be set up that high, other than trying to achieve this other intent to provide privacy for the first floor.
I see.
So the ramp becomes much longer, maybe twice as long as what would be needed, and particularly related to the CBH question. I wonder how we feel about that.
I mean, the way I interpret your question is basically you've got a floor level set and you're thinking, well, should I change the floor level in order to have a ramp with less slope? My feeling about that would be to be a little bit putting the cart before the horse. When we talk about minimizing the slope for the ramp, usually what we're thinking about is spreading out the ramp in plan rather than determining setting out using a ramp to determine the heights of things. But it may be.
In this case, Paul, the ramp was at the maximum slope, and it ended up about twice as long as it needed to be if the unit was set a little lower. It was set, a foot lower. So,
I mean, that being, the floor heights of units being such a fundamental feature, I'd be hesitant to change it too much. But I guess it's something to just think about on the next one. Okay.
Thank you. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Neil. Let's see. one more question, which is whether you happen to know the square foot of the sample unit that you showed.
Don't have that on hand, sorry.
But it's definitely 20% larger than the standard unit, right, Paul?
Absolutely. Notice I didn't provide a scale drawing, right? No, I mean, it's actually, you know, it's almost a real unit. It is derived from a unit that we did have in a project that was a CBH unit, but I made a few changes to it just for pedagogical purposes. So it doesn't exist in the world.
Great, thank you. Okay. I am going to turn it over to Bronya for a few last minute DHCD remarks around construction and how it's been going lately, as well as the applicability of these new design guidelines. Thank you.
I'm going to stop my share here.
So the question of the day is, when do these guidelines take effect? Well, technically speaking, they take effect now, but obviously if you're ready to go to construction, proceed, do the best you can. And if you find one or more of these new requirements, something that you think will be helpful, for example, making sure you have the headspace to fit that hard wire component in later, why not do that now if you can? For folks that are coming in for the very first time with a CBH project, we'd like you to really stare at these and see what you can incorporate. You may already have your building layout and you may already have your stack. I don't know if you can grow that unit 20% larger. If you can, please do. But obviously, we will be growing into these guidelines. We will be growing as a field. And if you can comply with as much as you can now, that would be great. The following year, we would expect, you know, a lot of compliance with the new guidelines. But again, we don't want to get anyone caught in the middle of what they're attempting to do, such as close on their construction law. That's obvious. This is not to disrupt. This is to enhance what we're doing as a field. Paul, can you go back to your final slide, because
Sure.
you included 2 web links just as a last minute reminder. I know that we all know about the state's COVID-19 workplace safety requirements for construction sites. We really are looking to all of you and your development teams to ensure the safety of your construction sites for workers, for tenants in place, and for our communities at large. And we really thank you for all your hard work on this.
Okay.
Are we at our time? We've got 3 minutes left. This is so well done.
I think are there any further questions maybe in the Q&A that?
Let's see. One question. Oh, am I muted? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Here's a question looking for clarity and guidance on grab bars at tubs and showers. And let's see. I am just trying to understand the question. Required for DHCD guidelines and CBH units. I think I will try to also allow this participant to ask the question directly. So bear with me for a moment while I do that. Sorry. Kevin, you are unmuted and you can ask your question about grab bars.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great, thank you. Sorry, it was a quick typed question as I was jamming in.
No problem.
There's in the design, well, at least in the prior version, there were the DHCD guidelines for grab bars at tubs and showers, blocking for future grab bars, and then the DHCD requirements.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, the CBH requirements. And then if it's at the head of the tub or the shower, for instance, just, you know, the orientation, is it vertical? Is it horizontal?
Yeah.
It just
So
said that the old checklist just said grab bars add. Am I missing something about the length, the orientation, the location? Just any guidance is helpful.
right. Yeah, I understand. So the intent of it, the requirement for blocking, I mean, we weren't specific in the CBH stuff about that because it's actually a code requirement. So this is one where we didn't want to overlap with code requirements. So that's kind of the first note to it. I believe it's in the universal design guidelines because it's applying across all units for a 12-inch bar at showers. Is that the one you're referring to?
Yeah, primarily.
Okay. And maybe we'll have to relook at those guidelines too and do another training, some other time. But what we've been doing, or what I've been doing, is to locate it on the foot end of a shower or tub, okay, and locate it vertically. Because the idea being is you can grab onto it in order to make a step into it. My feeling has always been that it's easier to hold on to something and get structural support like this rather than like that. So centering it about, so it's like kind of at a reasonable reach height, I might say center it. There isn't a code requirement for it, but the code requirement does cover the blocking. That's one thing that's not a CBH item.
So yeah, we just have all these same debates in the office because at the control end, it's nice to have it vertical. We agree with your interpretation that it's a good way to grab and if you have to reach for a control or a step in or out. And then conversely, if you have an aide or somebody helping, and if the seat's at the opposite side, then the bar is just as functional at the opposite, at the head end of the.
Yeah, I mean it's for the universal. So there's the code required, or one other guide you could look at to kind of help illuminate this would be the requirements for group 2B, because it actually tells you put in the grab bars and locate them.
Is easy. That's the clear part.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Any others?
Sorry, we are out of time. But if there are other questions, please feel free to email us. We're happy to continue the dialogue. And I want to note again that we are rerunning this training on November 12th at 2 p.m. So if you have someone in your office that missed it, or you just want to see us again, please encourage them to register. And please keep the questions coming. As Bronya said, we will be growing into this. And most of what we've learned from all of you. And I have no doubt that will continue to be the case. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you to Sarah and Bronya.